Warm welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. We begin with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, who says that Russia is open to peace talks over Ukraine, but that the only way to stop the conflict is for Western countries to end their arms supplies to Kyiv. Mr. Putin also repeated his accusation that the West was seeking to defeat Russia in Ukraine and said that Moscow had its own peace plan for the country. Well, President Putin declined to say whether Moscow would launch a new offensive in Ukraine in response to Kyiv's own counter-offensive, saying that Russia's plans would depend on its military potential. Putin also said that if necessary, Russia would use weapons with depleted uranium in response to reports that the US would supply such weapons to Ukraine. The Russian president was speaking during a meeting with Russian war reporters as well as bloggers. Well, still on more what the Russian president had to say. He believes Ukraine has lost 25 to 30% of military vehicles supplied by Western countries since the start of its counter-offensive, and that Ukraine's human losses are 10 times higher than Russia's. He added that Ukraine had lost many military personnel during the counter-offensive. Putin added that Russia had lost 54 of its tanks in the fighting, some of which could be repaired, and that Ukraine had lost over 160. Well, joining us for more on this is security expert Chidi Nwano. He joins us virtually from London. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Let's begin with what we're hearing from Russian presidents saying, peace is possible, but only if the West would stop supplying Kyiv weapons. Who believes this? Do you?
No. It's what he's expected to say. It's very unlikely that in the first instance, if we look at it from two different perspectives, the first instance is nobody, as you kind of alluded to, believes, that's going to happen, that the West will stop supplying Ukraine weapons, at least under this current political dispensation with the current team in the White House and the current mood across Europe. And in the second place, nobody also believes that even if that weapon supply stopped, that would be a prerequisite for peace. It's quite clear to, everybody by this stage that the Russian military objectives, extend beyond Ukraine simply not resisting. The Russian objectives, are to impose its own will upon Ukraine. And that is not something that's going to stop because the Ukrainians stop fighting.
And perhaps that's what a number of people are worried about. At what point do we take the Russian president for his words when he says the war is over, he will do this? Because we need to be able to identify, and that's for the future, if indeed this war would come to an end.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to understand the Russian end game or the Russian what the Russian objectives are, because number one, as we can tell from their public pronouncements, their objectives continuously change from Ukraine not joining NATO to demilitarization, denazification, protecting the Donbass, all of this kind of thing. The objectives consistently change. But what we can do is look at Russia's past wars, which have again been these type of colonial wars, fighting against, countries or elements that they consider to be theirs that want to have a separate path. Classic case being, Georgia, another classic case being Chechnya. So the general classic way that Russians end the war is, they'll defeat an enemy, impose their own government on it, and that government will be compliant towards the Russian objectives. So the Russian desired end states, the only way they can be guaranteed of peace would be to see the current, not necessarily just Zelensky, but everything that brought Zelensky to power, the entire Ukrainian democratic system, being either removed or subverted to Russia, a Russian compliant leader being in place, and that person being loyal or paying fealty to Russia is what happened in Chechnya with Kadyrov. And it's what happened, if we go back, through the years or through the decades when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. Exactly the same thing they did. They invaded, put their own person in there, and then that was, how the country was run.
And another thing we're seeing, the Russian president was addressing bloggers, he was addressing, some of the media, and one wonders, are the Russians buying this, the media as well? Also, he had a list saying that, it seems Ukraine had lost a lot more than his army, the Russian army has lost in this war, this offensive.
Well, he's always going to say that, and both sides are going to lie about what they've lost and what the other side have lost. That's standard. That's to be expected in war. Any serious kind of analyst takes everything that's brought out by any of the official channels with a pinch of salt. You can extrapolate a little bit by reading within the lines, but most of the official pronouncements, you really need to look at with a little bit of a side eye. In reality, the Russians have taken significant casualties, but the Ukrainians as well have taken quite significant casualties. There's been obviously the well-documented loss of Western-supplied weapons, the Bradleys, the Leopards, etc., but also other pieces of equipment. And this is to be expected. It's an attack against a prepared, fortified position. It's always going to be expensive for the attacker to make that kind of an assault, which is what the Russians found with their attack on Bakhmut. So with the offensive against Bakhmut, which the Russians, managed to sustain for 9 months, they lost a significant amount of men and material and expended a huge amount of ammunition. They prevailed in the end, but at a huge cost. The question is, the Ukrainians clearly cannot sustain that type of cost. The Russians, used prisoners, as the main kind of cannon fodder for that Bakhmut offensive. The Ukrainians can't sustain that kind of loss. So it becomes a battle of what is an acceptable loss to the Ukrainians. I do not believe that point is we're even anywhere near that point. I think the Ukrainians are still within, normal parameters for this type of operation. But it's still quite a high bill, especially for the men involved. In terms of...
I was going to ask if you think the counter-offensive from Ukraine's end would, give any marked difference. Do you think Russia is scared?
It's a very interesting question. I wouldn't use the word scared. I would say that they were most likely nervous. The counteroffensive is in a critical stage. We've passed through the shaping phase. We're not yet at the decisive phase, but we're in the phase where it's a breaking battle. And as we allude to, there is an element of this battle where the Ukrainians are trying to force the Russians to deploy all their forces to write down the Russian forces, while the Russians are obviously trying to prevent the Ukrainians from doing the same, from breaking through and also to destroy their forces. So it's a critical kind of phase where either side could win or could lose. Anybody telling you the Ukrainians are winning or the Ukrainians are losing or the Russians are winning or losing, there's no way you can tell. It's a battle. It's just going to keep going until one side breaks. The decisive points that you'll see is when the Russians are running out of reserves and are forced to commit these reserves. Again, we're not going to see that sitting here in Nigeria or in the UK, but that will be the change point of the battle. And this is where what I was leading to before. Will the Ukrainians be able to sustain this offensive to that point? So the Russians will not be afraid at this point. They're still in the fight. They've still got a good if this is football, it's still 1-1. There's anybody can score a goal, but they know that this is most like Ukraine's maybe, almost last chance. But they also don't have the offensive capability. This is where you now see the talk about peace talks coming in. Everybody is now looking for a way to be at a stronger position when these negotiations inevitably start.
Putin also said that if necessary, Russia would use weapons with depleted uranium in response to reports that the US would supply more weapons. What damage could that cause, the use of, what he calls depleted uranium weapons?
Well, depleted uranium, if it's depleted uranium, which is similar to what we use in the West, it's essentially the same as using, or almost similar to using, lead in bullets. It's a heavy metal. It penetrates armor quite efficiently. And the main reason the Americans use it is because they've got so many nuclear power stations, just like the Russians, that they've got a lot of uranium lying about. So when you deplete it, take out its radioactivity, it's just another inert heavy metal. What it is like all of the heavy metals is that when it disintegrates or fragments, it produces a cloud which, can, bring some health problems. And, the jury's still out as to, whether it's more dangerous than lead. But it's, the actual, comment from Putin is more par for the course. It's more, kind of tit for tat kind of a comment. It doesn't mean anything. If the Russians want to use depleted uranium, again, it's no worse than, using artillery or using phosphorus. It's just another horrible way to kill a human being.
Well, staying with, some of the plans that Russia has, the parliament have sort of backed a proposal for criminals to fight in Ukraine. They say the Ministry of Defense is signing contracts with suspected or convicted criminals to fight there. I mean, do you consider this as rather extreme or, part of the plans of the president?
It's not extreme. I mean, prisoners have already been fighting in Ukraine, under the Wagner kind of group. Now, Wagner is obviously technically a private military group, but in reality, it's a deniable adjunct of the Russian state. So bringing those people into a formal structure might be a little bit more difficult because Wagner being a quasi-official group can be a little bit different in its methods. And the Russian state, we might have the impression that the Russian state is, this kind of lawless place, but it's very bureaucratic. And once, you come in contact with the Russian state, there are a lot of laws and regulations that, that's part of the Russian contract with their people. They expect these certain basic laws to be followed. So I think it will be a very popular move with the Russian people in that they would much rather that prisoners were fighting and dying in Ukraine than their sons or their brothers. I believe Russia, again, is storing up a problem for the future because you're going to have a lot of hardened criminals coming back with combat experience, most likely with weapons and with, severe distress from, being on military operations.
But that's it, Chidi. Criminals are one thing, but suspected criminals, I mean, you're a suspect, so it's not yet agreed that you've actually committed the crime. You're innocent until you're convicted, so that's rather worrying.
So again, it's an interesting, one would say that this is maybe a trial balloon. They're throwing it out there to see what the response would be. But again, a lot of these things that are being said are kind of a way of preparing a population for what's coming. So as I said, the use of criminals would not be controversial. The use of suspects would definitely be controversial. But what Putin is most likely trialing is preparing his population for another round of mobilization or preparing the population for the use of conscripts, at the battlefront. Now, an interesting part of that talk, he mentioned the use of conscripts. Somebody asked him a question and it seemed quite deliberate to me about how did the conscripts perform, in Belgorod. And he was like, the conscripts performed very well and they clearly, they were well led and they did their duty. This could be a way of Putin kind of preparing the public for conscripts being deployed out into Ukraine itself. Again, one doesn't know. It's all kind of part of the of the messaging that's coming out from the Kremlin.
Well, staying with the Kremlin's posture, another thing he's doing with all of the sanctions that the West continues to implement against him, he's also meeting with, other parts of the world. We understand Wednesday he's meeting with the Cuban Prime Minister in Moscow and also other leaders, I think Africa as well, Latin America. What do you think the posture of these countries should be as he continues to wage this war in Ukraine?
Well, it's different. It's difficult to say what a country's policy would be. Logically, any country would, determine its policies based on its own interests. Now, it is in the interest of certain countries to support Russia because they're in conflict with the United States or with Ukraine's allies, or maybe they're getting cheap oil from Russia, or they just think Russia has the right idea. It will be in the interest of some countries to oppose Russia because either they believe Russia is in the wrong, or they've got economic incentives, or they just or they're in an alliance with other countries. It's very difficult to ascribe these things. What countries will generally act in their interest. But when you see a country like Cuba, it's very clear that Cuba is a long-term ally of Russia, is a long-term opponent of the United States. So it's quite clear where Cuba is going to align itself, and Cuba is very much dependent on oil from its friends, either Russia or Venezuela. So its alignment is kind of not in doubt. The African question is slightly different. As in African leaders, as I'm sure most people know, the African street, as it were, is quite pro-Russian, whilst African leaders have tried to remain neutral with the exception of a few countries. This reflects the realpolitik of it, in that whilst this is essentially a European war, a quarrel between European brothers, the knock-on effect has affected, Africans in terms of high oil prices, scarcity of high grain prices and fertilizer and things like that. So it is very much in the African interest of African countries for this war to end. The question is, how do they come about that end? Do they jump behind Russia and say the war should end with the West, taking away its support for Ukraine? Or do they support the West and say Russia should withdraw? It's not for me to kind of say which is the best, but it should be clear to all African countries that the West is most likely not going to stop supporting Ukraine, and Russia, whatever Russia achieves in this war, is not going to be decisive. So it would be a way of giving the Russians what has been described as a way out, an off-ramp, a way to end the war without losing too much face. If that comes through a negotiated peace deal and some territorial concessions, which is I think what will be the proposal, that might not be acceptable to the Ukrainians, but it might be a way for the African countries to maybe not throw Russia under the bus, but also not fully side with them.
Chidi, we'd like to thank you for weighing in on this issue, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Chidi Wano, security expert, thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, we continue with what's going on. And now the United States government is set to send depleted uranium tank shells to Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal reported a senior official told the WSJ that there appears to be no major obstacles to approving the ammunition after weeks of internal debate. Earlier this year, the U.S. decided to provide Ukraine with Abrams tanks and depleted uranium bombs, accompanying ammunition of the tanks. The Pentagon said the ammunition will be very effective against Russian tanks. In April, an official from Britain's Ministry of Defence confirmed that the UK had provided Ukraine with depleted uranium ammunition for UK-made Challenger 2 tanks. A US National Security Council's coordinator for strategic communication said that at that time, the use of such ammunition was going on for decades and its use is quite normal. The dense metal is used in munitions for its penetrating ability and protective material in armoured vehicles. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has met with President Joe Biden in the Oval Office, telling the US leader that Ukraine was making progress against Russia. He added Ukrainians are making advances and gaining ground in the counter-offensive, but that it's still early days in Kyiv's renewed push against Russia's invasion. Mr. Stoltenberg said the NATO alliance was preparing for the leaders' summit in the Lithuanian capital, where it was expected to step up further support for Ukraine.
Support that we are providing together to Ukraine is now making a difference on the battlefield as we speak, because the offensive is launched and Ukrainians are making progress, making advances. It's still early days, but what we do know is that the more land Ukrainians are able to liberate, the stronger hand they will have at the negotiating table.
We've strengthened NATO's eastern flank, made it clear that we'll defend every inch of NATO territory. And I say it again, the commitment of the United States and NATO's Article 5 is rock solid. And our summit in Lithuania next month, we're going to be building on that momentum from working to ensure that allies spend enough on defense, the 2%, not just as a hype, but that's the bottom line.
And that's exactly what we'll do when we meet all the NATO leaders at the summit in Vilnius next month, where we agree to sustain and step up our support to Ukraine, further strengthen our deterrence and defense, including by a new commitment to invest more in defense. And I expect allies to agree that 2% of GDP for defense has to be a minimum of what allies have to invest in our shared security.
Putin is making a mistake. He was looking for the Finlandization of NATO. He got the NATOization of Finland, and hopefully Sweden very shortly. And your friendship and leadership has meant a great deal.
President Putin must not win this war, because that will not only be a tragedy for the Ukrainians, but also make the world more dangerous. It will send a message to authoritarian leaders all over the world, also in China, that when they use military force, they get what they want. And we will then become more vulnerable. So it's our security interest to support Ukraine.